So welcome everybody to our new Rebalance talk today with Carl Honoré, which is a well-known bestseller author, thinker, and activist. So great to have you here with us, Carl.
It's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, let me begin by your first bestseller book, In Praise of Slowness. That as many people understand, it was I would say, a critique of industrialism, modernity, kind of basic values of these movements. And then you managed to integrate in a very successful way, in a persuasive manner, the rather positivism of Jeremy Rifkin with the, let's say, pessimistic skepticism of Milan Kundera, both mentioned and quoted in your book. So you did not say that fast is bad or wrong. Instead, you said something which is self-evident, maybe, which is that fast cannot always be our default value.
Mm.
So in the book, you also say, I don't know if in the book or in another talk or in another book or article, that you want to find a way to live better by striking a balance between fast and slow. This is quite fundamental statement for us in the
Mm.
research we are. So I have to ask you to further elaborate this point to begin with.
Sure. I'll start off with what you started off with, which was the title of my first book, which is In Praise of Slow or Slowness, depends where you are in the world. And in a way, if you hear that title, you think that I'm an extremist of slowness, I am a fundamentalist of slow, and all I want is slow. But of course, that's not what it is at all. And it's more like what you described, that I think of slow with a capital S as being, I think of it really as being a mindset or a way of being or a spirit. And it's about doing things. I mean, musicians have a lovely expression. They talk about the tempo giusto, right? The correct tempo for each piece of music. Natural, correct, right, adequate tempo for each moment. And that's, in a sense, I think what slow is all about. It's about arriving at whatever it is you're doing, whether you're teaching children in a classroom, making love to your partner, cooking a meal, driving through town, playing a sport, finishing a quarterly report, doing a Zoom, whatever it is, you do it at the right speed, the right tempo, right? And that's the sort of start explanation, but there's a deeper layer, I think, to the whole slow revolution. It's kind of not just about fast, slow tempo. It's also a way of being, right? So I think of it as being quality before quantity. It's about, I mean, people talk about being present and in the moment. And in recent years, we've had the boom of mindfulness. I think there's an element of being mindful that's in there too. It's about doing one thing at a time, which sounds very simple, but actually is profoundly countercultural in a world obsessed with multitasking. So for me, slow really is not about doing everything as fast as possible. It's really about doing everything as well as possible. And so each of us will have our own tempo giusto, right? We each have our own internal metronome. And so what's fast for you might seem quite slow to me, and what's reasonably okay for that person over there might seem really fast for the other person beside them. So the vision of slow is that each person, insofar as possible, tries to move through each moment of the day as close to the right tempo for that moment as possible for them, but also taking into account other people's tempos too. So it's not a selfish, me first, my tempo above all else. It's understanding that we're in an orchestra. There are different tempos, different instruments, and we've got to make our music together. So sometimes I may have to go a little faster than my tempo in order that I'm in harmony with your tempo, and we can make beautiful music together.
Yeah, I see. But then my question is why let's say why the idea that you are advocating that moving more slowly when you have to be more slowly, you have to move slowly, when you have a reason for that, when you control your time and you prefer to go slowly because of a question of quality or whatever, why this is provocative in a way or misunderstood, easily misunderstood? Have some hypothesis that why this is even surprising for many people? Maybe because speed has kind of embedded pleasure. There is an aesthetical pleasure, an ecstasis, which is exploited by commercial companies like Nike. Just do it, don't think twice. Or do you like driving? Is saying BMW. Or be curious, fly even more.
Hmm.
Say Vueling, an air company. Now, how to resist this attraction of speed? Because slowness is attached to the value of the attitude. I mean, being boring, lazy, not socially useful. It seems that speed is more socially useful.
Yeah, well, that
Slow is kind of individualistic, even selfish.
I would,
Why this is so
yeah,
provocative?
I would argue that it's the opposite, that
Yeah,
speed is individualistic and selfish. Speed isolates us from each other. It cuts us off. It breaks human connections. It turns us into little balls of selfish consumption where all we can see is our own to-do list and our own climb up the corporate ladder. And we become the opposite of what I'm preaching, which is by slowing down, that's how we realize what's important. We identify meaning, we listen, we hear, we connect, we communicate with other people. So obviously I completely disagree with the premise, but I accept the premise. And why do we feel that way? Well, I mean, we live in a culture that's just marinated in the idea that slow is bad. I mean, it's just synonymous, as you say, with all these negative things like lazy, boring, unproductive, stupid, that you're just roadkill, right? If you slow down. And I think that makes it that cultural taboo that is so deep and abiding in our culture makes it very hard for us to slow down. So even when we can feel in our bones that it would be good for us to slow down, our body is crying out for some slowness, our mind is yearning to put on the brakes, we still don't do it because of the taboo. We feel ashamed, we feel guilty, we feel embarrassed, we feel disgusted, and so we just carry on going faster. So I think that's one of the main reasons that we get stuck in fast forward, is that the culture, there's a kind of wall of inertia that we need to break through in order culturally to accept the idea of slowing down. But I think you put your finger on something important there as well, another important variable in the equation, which is that speed is sexy, right? It's
yeah.
fun, it's an adrenaline rush, it's a thrill, right? So of course that's appealing. But the idea that you would have a sexy adrenaline rush feeling 24 hours a day is ludicrous, right? That's how you end up a heroin addict, right? Or a meth head. And that's not really anything anybody wants to aspire to. So it's like you want highs and lows. You want moments of speed and thrill and excitement. I mean, people often think part of the taboo, certainly when I first started talking about slow and stuff, people always, when they read my book, they would always expect me to be a Buddhist monk with a shaved head
Yes.
and a yoga mat and stuff, right? And I'm not like that at all, right? I love speed, right? I'm speaking to you from London, which is a city of enormous volcanic energy and speed. I love London and I love fast sports. I love speed. But that doesn't mean you can't also love slowness, right? In fact, I think the two can be married beautifully and elegantly together if we get past the cultural taboo and we also almost re-educate both our minds and our bodies to wean ourselves off the addiction to stimulation, distraction, sexy, adrenaline, fast, speed, thrill stuff, because ultimately that's unsatisfying and it's damaging. It's not any long-term, it's not a long-term proposition being stuck in fast, sexy adrenaline mode. I mean, it simply isn't, right? So, it's interesting. And I see the tectonic plates in my mind are shifting, right? In the cultural conversation, the move away from some of the messaging, as the slow movement as a whole has, exploded into every corner of human activity, starting in many ways you could argue with slow food, but now you find it everywhere. You also find it in the advertising world. You cited a few examples there of companies using slogans that tap into this idea that faster is better. And well, there was another one, you mentioned BMW. Well, Audi, when they brought out the R8 sedan in the UK, the tagline they used for Audi, I first saw it when I was sitting in a cinema and I couldn't believe it. My mouth just dropped. It said, the slowest car we've ever built. And I thought,
wow.
What? Wait a minute. Did I just see that? Did everyone else in the cinema see that? How could that be? And of course, Audi doesn't mean that the R8 would struggle to overtake a horse-drawn carriage on the motorway, or, what they mean is that we built this car with a slow spirit. In other words, we took time, we focused, we didn't rush, we didn't cut corners. We made, what they mean when they say the slowest car is they mean the best car. And so I think there are many, many more examples of that in the culture, and it's incumbent on all of us, both as consumers, to respond well to that kind of advertising and to ask for it, but also for advertisers to supply it. And it's happening, I think, on both sides of the fence, that you're getting more and more of this, and it's eroding that culture that tells us that faster is always better. That's weaker than it was 15 years ago, I think.
So you're positive, I mean, optimist. You believe that new generations will be, able to rebalance
I
all
think
these
so.
concepts, and the pandemics will help us. So what's your experience on the pandemics?
I
Is it
think
gonna
before I talk
help?
about the pandemic, I'll just pick up the first part of your question, which is the young
Yes.
gen. Because I think the young generations is exactly where hope resides. And there's so much pompous dismissal of the young. In English, we talk about the young people being entitled and snowflakes, and they're also, all they want to do is spend all their time on Instagram, and they don't want to work. If you go into the real world, that's not the case, right? The young generation actually have a very different conception of the world. In one hand, they're looking at my generation, say like Generation X and so on, and saying, we don't really want that, right? They're saying, I don't want to sacrifice my health, my dreams, my soul, my life on the altar of what? A very fast life, never seeing my family, burning out at 52. They don't want that. So if you go to human resource departments around the world, and I do it because this is what I do in my work, they will tell you that the young coming into the offices now are saying, you know what, we want to work hard, we want to do well, but we want to go home at 6 p.m. to give our child a bath, right? Or, see our baby before he or she goes to sleep at night. Something that a 52-year-old, my generation, we would never have said that. We would have been too scared because
Yeah.
it would seem slow and weak and lazy. That the kids now say, no, if you don't want me to do that, you want me to work a 39-hour day, I'll go across the street and work for someone else, or I'll launch my own company and work on my own terms. So there's a big shift coming from the next generation. They also have a very different conception about the environment and the planet and how we interact with nature. Greta Thunberg being a good example, right? So a big part of slow that often gets forgotten is building a slower relationship with the planet, creating a natural relationship with the world around us so that we don't destroy planet Earth. And again, I have a lot of hope that the next generation is going to do more for that than my generation ever did, to be honest. So the pandemic.
Pandemic, yeah.
I think the pandemic, when the pandemic first hit, so many people wrote to me and said, you must be so happy, right? because the world has been forced. And at no point have I ever been happy about the pandemic. Is a total nightmare, right, for everyone in many ways. But I do think that it has brought a silver lining, which is that it's forced us collectively and individually to reckon with slowness, right? To do less and to spend time sometimes just doing nothing at all, to deal with boredom, to have to be alone with our thoughts, all that stuff that people before the pandemic would either avoid doing, or they would pay lots of money to go to a retreat to have some guru teach them how to do it, right? Suddenly they were all doing it in their own homes, right? Because we had no choice. You couldn't go outside. And I think a lot of people have learned that there are upsides to that kind of slowness, right? You across social media, in the mainstream media, in your own social circle, you hear of people having taken this time to slow down, thinking, you know what? I'm going to change. I'm making some changes now. I've not been living the right life for me. I want to do something different in the world. I want to work differently. I want to maybe move out of a big city and go to a small town. I want to walk more. There's so many things that are coming out of the pandemic now that fit with the slow revolution. Just one example is the fact that people are going on enormous walks, just walking around their neighborhood. Like my neighborhood in London is full of people just walking on their own, just walking, right? Which nobody ever did before, right? But now I go myself for, I go for like 8-kilometer walks almost every day now, just as a way of, and I used to walk before, but it just has become something more that people do. And I think walking is one of the supreme acts of slow. So that's one example, but there are many more as people get back to food and all the baking that people are doing at home and the arts and the crafts. And I think the pandemic could turn out to be a reset moment in many ways for us in the world.
And let me ask you something that Mateo Turro is asking us. He says that he find interesting that the watch you have on the wall is stopped. This is in purpose?
Well noticed. Yeah. Well, it's a grandfather clock that hasn't worked for 20 years. But this week, for some reason, I just suddenly thought, you know what? I'm going to start having it in my talks. So I always wait to see how many minutes it takes for somebody to recognize. So that was Arturo, was it? Well, that was 15 minutes. That's a new record, right? So Arturo was the fastest person to recognize the slow clock so far.
I will congratulate him. Let me ask you three different reasons to criticize what we are just talking. The first one by another colleague of us watching this conversation, which is Wasim. He says, how do you reply to the critic that the slow movement is about nostalgia? A dream, a regressive past, is going back to a primitive way of living.
That's been a worry about the slow movement from the very beginning. And I suspect that some people within slow are animated by nostalgia. But my experience is that it's not the case, that for most people, that I don't see this. I mean, I see it as taking or preserving what was good about the past and marrying that with what is good, luminously good about the present, right? I'm not somebody who wants to go back to a pre-industrial era. We can't do that, I don't believe. I think we've got to make the best and the most of the world as it is around us today. And that means using technology, tapping, global supply chains, rethinking what we have now that's modern and recalibrating it so that it delivers a slow world for us. For me, when people say, oh, that's just very nostalgic, I think that's not understood. It's a failure to understand what slow is all about. And B, it also implies that there's something bad about nostalgia. What's wrong with a bit of nostalgia, right? I mean, if I'm it's quite nice to be nostalgic for a time when you can walk out of your house and you can't be reached by a phone, right? So why not enjoy that? Sometimes I go out with my phone, sometimes I don't, right? Is the second option nostalgic? Maybe it is. If it is, I'm okay with that, right? Nostalgia is it's not a dirty word to me, right?
No, it's not. The second criticism is related to this, because when we say nostalgia, maybe there is a conservative flavor here, and maybe there is a class element. So the idea of controlling your time is in a way related to your wealth, to the power you have. So, the kinetic hierarchy that Creswell talks about is people that can control. So this reasoning is good, but only applies to those people with the income level and the power to be in control of their own time. If we go to slums on large megalopolis all over the world, or in some places also in the Western world, the peripheries of them, it seems that the working class, they have to, go as fast as possible to the job, come back home.
You can even find, you don't even need to go to the, favelas of Brazil for that. You can you can talk to an Uber driver in London, right? Or someone working in a fulfillment center in Amazon outside New York, right? It's going to be the same thing. Yeah, I mean, I think a key element of slow is temporal autonomy. It's giving control of time back to the individual. And that's something that we lost, I think, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where we effectively gave over control of our money to the elite, the power brokers, the system, in return for money. Time is money, as Benjamin Franklin said. That was the deal we did, right? And you could argue that for a long time it was a pretty decent deal for many people. I've got my doubts about that, but now I think it's a very poor deal, right? I think what we really want is to have control over our time again, and to change what we built in the 19th century. Now we can't do that overnight, right? It's not going to happen in a week. It's not going to happen in a year, but it can happen. And what's inevitable is that the first people who are going to enjoy that temporal autonomy are going to be people who have a bit more power, a bit more leverage in the culture, a bit more room to maneuver. So that may be people at the very top. It may also be white collar workers or freelance workers who are creatives who can, travel around the planet, work from wherever, that they've got some of that temporal autonomy as well. But, what we need to aspire to is, and I think what we can get to eventually, is a world where everybody has much more control over their own time. And that to me means that it's not an elitist movement that stops now when we've clawed back time control just for rich people, because that, to me, that doesn't make, that's not what we want, right? It's just pointless. That's just a different kind of tyranny. We want something that's open, flat, and democratic. And, you know, I think we're starting to see, I mean, one example just recently, the idea of technology, and of course, that's been a big question in the pandemic, is people working at home. And the upside is that many companies have discovered that people are more productive at home, and many people find they work better at home, or sometimes work better at home. So that's going to be something we carry on later on. And one reason I think people who do work better at home work better at home is because they have control over their time. You know, they can get up a little later in the morning. They can maybe do their creative work between 11 and 12 because that suits them, and then do something else, you know, administrative from, you know, and work around their own tempo, their own metronome. And that's really, I think, what the ideal scenario is right across the economy. We're just getting a taste of it, I think, with the pandemic. And some companies now who are clever and forward-looking are looking at ways to harness that learning, that lesson, so that we can take it forward from the pandemic. But of course, the downside is that other people have found themselves overwhelmed by technology in the home, not sure how to turn off Zooms 99 hours a day. You know, so this is the transition phase, and there's going to be bad stuff during that. But I think we're starting to see the silhouette of what control over your time and your technology can look like in the home and the workplace, and making those two work together. So I feel optimistic that we can learn some useful lessons there. Just one final footnote on the idea of tech. I mean, Ireland this month passed a new law or guidelines on the right to disconnect. So to give workers the right to stop, basically slow down, just stop working, switch off, not have to look at their inbox, not have to get on the company intranet, not have to do that extra Zoom, whatever it is. Britain, the UK is looking at Ireland, there's an idea now has been brought up to do the same thing here. So, you know, as I say, the tectonic plates are shifting below the surface. We maybe don't see it entirely up above, but it's happening deep down below. And I think more and more we're going to see things happening above ground.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the, I will say, very friendly criticism of Judy Wachman? You know her very well. The feminist criticism of Judy Wachman.
Mm-hmm.
That basically, if I understand her right, also she criticized, let's say, the latest book on time by Byung-Chul Chah, with the Korean philosopher is praising slowness as well, in order to have a, let's say, a better life. So he's praising the idea of vita contemplativa, the idea of contemplation, not just moving slowly, but having time to contemplate, to observe, to think about, to follow a different rhythm. But I think, according to Judy, this seems individualistic. This seems not very much feminist, in the sense that she prefers the time spent with the others, the time of care. So it seems to me that she's looking in a different direction. And what is do you understand the feminist criticism of this movement?
Well, I think, I'm not sure if that's particularly, but there's certainly one feminist criticism of it, which I think is very fair. And we've seen a light shone on it during the pandemic, is the unfair distribution of labor in the home, right? So it's
yes,
right. And so that has been exacerbated during the pandemic. So we've seen men doing some more help at home, but not enough, right? It's the women again who are carrying the can. So that seems to be an utterly fair criticism to make. To me, that's not a criticism of the slow movement. That's just a criticism of the world that we live in, right?
yes.
Which is still a world that has a very long way to go to reach gender parity. So I agree with that side of it. What's interesting, I think what you're setting up there is almost like a standoff between the contemplative life, which the New Age people might describe as self-care, and what Judy is describing as care of others, like the connection with others, right?
Yes, that's the point. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's what. Yeah, and I mean, I guess the question is, how does slow fit into that?
Yeah.
To me, slow does not exclude either. It's both of those things, right? Because when you slow down, a big part of it is having time and space to look inside yourself, to reflect, to do Socrates, the examined life, to work out who you are, what lights you up, and how you're going to move through the world. That's important metaphysical, intellectual homework we all have to do. But it doesn't stop there, right? I mean, that the end game is not just to spend all hours of the day contemplating. I mean, that's going to be part of it, but that only gives you the strength and the roundness of character to go out and do what really matters for human beings, which is to interact with others, to be of service, to help, to do the stuff that Judy's talking about, which is to get out there and just be social, right? To be with other people. And there's a wonderful African proverb, actually, which sums up a lot of what I think about slow. And we talked about this at the very beginning of the conversation, that I think of fast as being selfish, right? And slow as being the opposite of selfish, right? Being altruistic, being connected, doing collective, right? It's about finding our harmony as an orchestra together and moving forward. The proverb is this: it's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that, to me, sums up a lot of what slow is all about. But in order to go together and to be the best version of yourself in that group of people going together, you need to have some of what Han is talking about, the moments of quiet. Rembrandt, in his famous studio in Amsterdam for painters in 16th century, right? They all the painters in Rembrandt's studio painted together in a collective single room where they shouted, finished each other's hands, exchanged ideas, teased each other, played together. But each painter in that studio also had a quiet, private space they could retreat to do the contemplation, the reflection, the sort of self stuff. And I think that's a good metaphor as well, that moving back and forth between the moment of quiet, alone, solitude, and the moment of togetherness where it all comes. And that's how I see slow. That's what for me is slow in action.
Great. Let's move to another subject, and it's not another subject, another version, another dimension of the ideas you're advocating, thinking about, which is the rules of aging bodily, with your latest book. So it seems that you are in a way presenting being, not young as something positive as well. So it's not negative to become old, as maybe modernity have been telling us. You remember this song, very famous song, Forever Young, which is a kind of praising to be young. And the song is really, really good because the song is asking us why we have to be old. It makes no sense. Maybe it makes no sense. So it's better to die young. This is the romantic idea. And they say it's so hard to get old without a cause. So you need a reason to be old. It's not even, it's not, I will say, in line with human wishes. We have to be forever young, die young.
Well, forever young is, like you say, is a romantic idea, but like many romantic ideas, it's totally wrong, right? So if you think of Pete Townsend, perfect example, right? The guitarist from The Who, he wrote when he was in his 20s one of the most ageist, cult of youth lyrics in the pop music canon. He wrote, remember that famous song in my generation, "Hope I Die Before I Get Old"?
Yes.
When Pete Townsend reached his 60s, he said, you know what? I'm a lot happier now in my 60s than I was when I wrote that line in my 20s. So, yeah, the cult of youth is just like most cults. It's distorted and it's wrong and it doesn't make any sense, especially in a world where we're living better for longer than ever before.
Yeah. So what are your rules for aging bodily?
Well, I've got lots of rules. I mean, I think a first one is to keep on learning, right? I mean, we hear it's a bit of a cliche in the corporate world, lifelong learning, but we know that exposing yourself to novelty, new experiences keeps you recharged, keeps you fresh, keeps you agile cognitively and physically. So wherever you can, seek out new experiences, whether that's, going to a website you've never been to before, or trying a new food, or visiting a new part of your city or something. Just newness, right? Keeps you fighting fit. I think another way of growing aging well, comes back to what we were talking about, social connection. So huge library of research that shows that loneliness is actually worse for us in many ways than smoking or obesity, right? Because we're social animals. So to age well, to age boldly, keep up strong social networks, right? Don't fall into the isolation trap and cut yourself off, just always trying to put yourself out there socially. Invest time in relationships. Obviously there's the obvious ones about eating a good diet and, exercise. And we know that exercise is almost like I hesitate to say a silver bullet, but it has an extraordinary beneficial effect, not only on the body, but on the mind, right? For keeping mind and body healthy.
Let me ask you about the most difficult one for me, maybe the one that deserves to be better explained. When you proposed that we have to think about death, think about death, because you say an awareness that time is finite gives life shape and meaning.
Yeah.
And spurs you to make the most of here and now. So in a way, you are saying that the value of present is not to be neglected. So the value of future in modernity seems always preferable to think on the future.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, no, let's focus on the present. Now let me read you 3 other people saying something similar,
Mm-hmm.
in order to you have a reference to precise and refine your argument. Very different people. The first is Matthew from the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
He says, what's the purpose to win the world if you lose your soul? What's the purpose to rush to win the world if you lose your soul? This is Matthew. Another quote is from a popular Spanish singer called Julio Iglesias. He has a song that he says, from so much waiting to be the first in everything, I forgot to live.
Oh, I didn't know that question.
And in ancient Greek, uh, your inner life is the same as soul. So it's the same losing your life or losing your soul. And the last one maybe is more sophisticated, from a philosopher that happens also to be engineer, Wittgenstein, that he says, in philosophy, always wins the slowest philosopher, the philosopher that arrives at the end.
Yeah.
Now, you have three sources to inspire your answer of this very difficult question, I would say.
Well, first of all, let me say that I salute all 3 of these great thinkers, including Julio Iglesias, perhaps the greatest of the 3. I think that was one of the things that I found most interesting in my research, because what went for my book Bolder about aging was I was going through doing all the reading and so on, and came across this idea that thinking about death was a good way to age well, and also a good way to focus on the present. And I know personally that I just didn't really want to think. I've just pushed death away, never really thought about it. But then as you begin to, delve deeper into, especially into philosophy and into other religions, you realize that every major religion pretty much around the world has some form of death meditation, right? So that people contemplate death at some sort of point in the religious cycle. And the reason always given is that I think it gives you a kind of humility, right? For a start, makes you realize that you're not going to be here forever. You're really not as significant as you think you are. And that you have a limited space of time. And so what you find is that these death meditations are always presented as a way of focusing on what those 3 thinkers, focusing on the now, right? The glory, the beauty, the luminosity of the now, of the moment. And one of the things that I did when I was researching the book was you can download an app called We Croak, which is kind of English slang for we die, right? So what it does is that it sends you, every so often, it just sends you a little quote on your phone, a little quote, it could be from a great novelist or a philosopher, and it just a quote about death, right? Which sounds really morbid and a bit sick, right? But I thought I'll give it a try. And actually, I have to say that I found it really quite comforting in a weird strange, surprising sort of way, because I found, especially if it arrived at a time when I was worrying and stressing about, I don't know, if my life and what was going, I would just think, you know what, it's okay. This will all end, and I may as well just focus on what's here right now in front of me. And I found it weirdly a very helpful app. It's not on my phone anymore. I feel like I've kind of learned that lesson. But as I said, as you quoted me saying earlier, I do think that when you have an awareness of death, then it does give life shape, gives it meaning, gives it texture, and it nudges you into the present, which is so much about what slow is all about.
Okay.
And actually, what just going, I just had a sudden thought as well, that anyone who's sort of, maybe under 40 and thinks, oh no, I can't be thinking about death, or how can older people think about death? Actually, again, surprisingly, the research shows very clearly that as we get older, we become less afraid of death. It's actually when we're younger that we're more afraid of death, which seems a paradox and surprising. But across all cultures, people become less afraid of death. Now, you may be afraid of getting very ill or being, of course, that's a nightmare, and everybody's terrified of that in various ways. But the actual end, we get sort of better at kind of just being at ease, calm, and tranquil about it. And yeah, and there's another lesson, I think, from coming back to the pandemic about old versus young, that what we've seen in all the research, of course, we know that older people are more vulnerable. It's reminded us that older people are more vulnerable physically, right? We're more likely to get sick, we're more likely to die from COVID. But across the world, again, studies have shown that older people in the second half of life are coping better emotionally with the fallout from the pandemic, with the stress, the fear, the anxiety. And that's something we know from all the research, that as you get older, you get more resilient emotionally, you get stronger. So maybe you get a little weaker physically, but you get stronger emotionally. So again, it's that whole idea. It's when I'm tackling the cult of youth, I don't want to replace it with the cult of the codger, right? Or the cult of the old person. It's about saying every age has its pros and cons, but every age can be wonderful, but only if you embrace it. Embrace that age when you are that age, instead of pining for the past, nostalgia, right? Or, fearing and shrinking from the future, right? Is you've got to be in the moment, living that age with an open mind.
Okay. And do you think that, what you're feeling about, that technology will release us from the inconvenience of aging, like it or not? So, what if Ray Kurzweil, chief engineer in Google, has reason, and in 20, 30 years, we can live forever if we want? So, what's your feelings
Well,
about?
my feeling, I've got two feelings. The first is on the science, right? And it's very clear, or clear to me anyway, from all the research I've done, that we are still, when it comes to ending death and permanent eternal life, we are still in the realm of science fiction. We are not in the realm of science. And there is a long, long way to go. And I actually, I have some serious doubts if we will ever get there. I think it's highly likely that we are topping out right about now. We're hitting kind of the end point of where average life expectancy can go. I mean, we might get it up to 100. This idea that even we get to 120, 40, 50, or let alone 500, I don't buy it scientifically. But then who knows? I mean, I couldn't have imagined the iPhone 20 years ago. So what do I know, right? But that's the science side. I think on the kind of cultural metaphysical side, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, it's although we don't talk about death very much, death is an intensely powerful definer of how we are in the world, how we think about ourselves, how our relationships are formed, how we plan and experience our lives. If we remove it from the equation, I mean, I don't want to say game over, but it's back to zero on everything, right? It's a reset, a reboot of everything. And then you're into a parlor game of looking into a crystal ball and saying, well, I think it could be this, or I honestly don't know. I mean, I suspect, I mean, we certainly, there's been a lot of dystopic science fiction novels and movies about ending death. And it tends to be a dystopia, right? As a general rule. I mean, there's not much utopia happening when we get rid of death, isn't it, right? Now, that may be a bias of people who write science fiction novels and scripts, or it may be just kind of what ends up happening if we do pull off this scientific miracle. I don't know. I mean, Would I want to, I mean, I guess would you want to live forever? Certainly not getting physically older all the time. You'd want to stop the aging. And what point would we stop the aging physically? At 30, 25, 40? I mean, all these incredibly difficult questions would come up. I'm not sure if we're mature enough as a species to cope with that kind of, I was going to say gift. I'm not sure if it is a gift. It might be a
Yes,
poison
yes,
chalice. It
yes,
might be a
yes,
poison
yes,
chalice,
yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And do you think that people values the change on the values of new generations may have an influence on the evolution of technology, either by voting one party, another party, and the government, or by consuming one or another device, or technology is moving autonomously from people wishes?
I think the gadgets, the actual tech, the the guts of the system is probably moving more or less independently as researchers just come up with things and throw them out into the world. But it seems to me that there's a whole other layer that goes on between the physical hardware tech and how it arrives into our lives. And I feel that's an area that doesn't get enough scrutiny, right? It's because we haven't looked hard enough at that area that we've ended up going from the tech to Facebook being, in my view, a poisonous influence in many ways around the world, right? Social media having a toxic effect, uh, algorithms that are racist and sexist. I mean, all these things there's that middle stage where we go from the hardware to the consumer interface. So much more attention needs to go onto that. And I do think that younger generations, generally, who are more savvy, more au fait with technology, they're more sophisticated. And I think that more and more they're asking those difficult questions about, who is writing the algorithm and why, and what's the real effect of this? We need some light to be shone into these dark corners where technology that is determining every moment of our life is being forged. And I think the next generation will demand that, because my generation, I mean, we feel uncomfortable about some aspects of social media, but we're going along for the ride now, mostly. I think it's probably going to be incumbent on the next generation to
Mm.
move the dial. And I think they are, they are doing it. They're coming into the workplace. You can even see within Google, you can see young employees within Google speaking publicly against Google, or Google was, I think they were going to take on a project with the Pentagon that was a military. Their staff just said, that's not what we signed up for, and Google backed off. So, this idea that corporate behemoths are omnipotent and can't be moved or changed, I don't buy it. And we are, through our millions of small acts of defiance, we can move the dial. We can make big seismic changes, and I think that will come. I think that will come, and I think it's already coming.
Okay. Now let's move to a question related to urban and transport planning that is also very interesting for us. I'd like to read a criticism of your Praise and Slowness book by a colleague and friend of me that he knew that we were going to talk, and he sent me a short text and two questions, which are very, very interesting for us. Well, his name is Francesc Robuste, so hello, Francesc, if you are there. He's a transport engineer with a scientific mind, let's say.
Good combination. Good combination.
Not like me. And he wrote, I have read the book In Praise of Slowness, and I enjoyed it very much. It is a mature perspective, a Zen philosophy, he says. I don't know if you agree 100%. A Zen philosophy to life, opposite to the childish rushing for everything, paying attention to and enjoying small things and living the present, as opposed to a roller coaster of sensations, searching future happiness, or forgetting living and present. I think he's very much on the point. You have to tell me if my understanding is right. My concern, he says, is when you apply this philosophy of life to mobility. It is okay for road safety purposes, for enjoying the city with less number of vehicles and less speed, because speed is aggressive. The energy depends on the square of the speed. But many attributes of our current quality of life in developed countries are due to the speed. So to overcome distance and time in a fast way. He says transportation operating costs are lower with higher speeds, buses and public transportation in general, freight transportation. So speed is very, very useful, and and therefore cities have to be ready to be, like Le Corbusier said, uh, good machines that move fast. And then the two questions. First, what is the right trade-off, the right speed?
Mm.
You before you were telling us that you are interested not in slowness per se, but in the right slowness and the right speed.
Mhm.
Now, what is the right speed on the city? So what is the ideal city you have in mind that things are moving in the right speed?
Yeah.
It's not an easy question,
Yeah.
but we are interested to know what you're feeling
Sure.
about.
Well, I think if the question is asking for an actual number, like a speed, I'll take the experience I have most intimately, which is with my own city, London, right? Where most of the main roads are 30 miles an hour, which is what, that's in kilometers, that's going to be 47, 48 kilometers an hour, maybe 50 kilometers an hour. And then in recent years, much of the city, many of the other roads in some neighborhoods, whole neighborhoods, now it's 20 miles an hour, which is about 32 kilometers per hour. And I think that's that kind of balance somewhere in there seems to me to work. I mean, I think you want 20 miles an hour. So that's what, let's say roughly 30 kilometers, 32 kilometers an hour feels to me a human, it is aggressive having a car traveling at that, but it doesn't feel oppressively aggressive somehow. I think there's a palpable difference between 30 miles an hour, well, 50 and 30, let's say roughly 50 kilometers an hour. Sorry, I'm getting confused with the 50 kilometers an hour and 30 kilometers an hour, I think does make a difference to the quality of life, to the way people feel who are pedestrians, cyclists, walking around in the space who are not in a car. Having that car traveling more slowly, so at 30 kilometers an hour, does make a
For you,
difference.
is a mix. What is
I
best?
think so, because some roads, you're going to have some roads that are more like arteries, and it's okay. I think you're not going to have human beings, pedestrians so much, so it's okay to go a bit faster there. But I think wherever the car is close to human beings, the human body, I think you want to be keeping it down around 30. And I,
30.
yeah,
But
and
then there is a more radical possibility, which is to remove vehicles and to move them aside, above, flying as drones,
yeah,
or underground as tubes. So you leave the space for people walking or bikes going at
yeah.
50 kilometers per hour. So you remove vehicles, and then you have the space for the people. This is one possibility, and the other is the one you are telling us, which is kind of a mix of slow
Well,
vehicles and people all together.
yeah. I mean, that one I see as more practical because that's, imagine the infrastructure investment involved in moving all vehicles below ground. I
Yeah.
mean, that feels to me like we're moving towards, again, utopia and science fiction. But I'm happy to go there. I love the idea of putting things like that underground or moving them out of the space so that, I mean, anytime you go anywhere in the world and go to a neighborhood where they've removed cars altogether, I mean, there's just a kind of human flourishing that occurs. You hear children, you see them playing in the street. People start forming more businesses. They get to know their neighbors better. And to me, that seems to me what a city should be aspiring to, is to human blossoming, not to moving an Amazon package from A to B 3.5 minutes faster in the morning on a Monday, right? If it comes to priorities, I'm going to put priority on the first thing, which is creating an environment where human beings can flourish and blossom and connect and create a community. So I guess everything involves a trade-off. And I suppose picking up on your friends, your colleagues' idea, I guess I would be in favor of losing some of the speed and having more of the humanity. That would be my, but I want to keep some of the speed. I'm not saying you stop cars and make them drive at 10 kilometers an hour. That's absurd, right?
Yeah.
I think, somewhere you've got to find some sort of happy medium. The other thing to remember about cities is that there's a false economy that goes on in cities that you end up, and you know, when people are driving and they can drive faster, or you build more roads, what happens? People don't go, you don't get more speed, you get more cars, and then everything slows down, you got more traffic, right? So, you know, and so London, you know, created a congestion charge zone where you've got to pay quite a lot of money to go into the center of town in a car at any time of day, all week. And there's still traffic in the center of London, but I mean, imagine what it would be like without it. You know, before the congestion charge was introduced in London, the average speed of a journey in London was slower than it had been in the 19th century when people traveled by horse, right? Because there was so much traffic, right? So I think that speed is often a false god, and that you know, we think we're going to deliver speed and efficiency through transport in the urban world. But as soon as we bet on speed, we lose. We so often lose, and we get side effects, we get, you know, unintended consequences. And so I would always prefer not to bet on the speed. It's important to move around in the, you know, vehicles, but that shouldn't be our priority, I don't think.
And you have been well connected to the city slow movement. You have been part of this movement. What is the situation of this movement right now? What they are doing? What ideas they have in the future?
Yeah. Well, what I find most interesting about slow cities, it's slightly a misnomer, because you think city big, but it's actually that technically you have to be a town of 50,000 inhabitants or fewer, which to me isn't really quite a city. It's more of a town, right? So what I find most interesting about the slow city movement is, in effect, its domino effect, its knock-on effect outside, like bigger cities. Because it seems to me that in the last 10, 15 years, big megalopolises around the world have embraced slow ideas from slow cities movement. And the one that we all see, most of us, is, you know, networks of public bicycles, right? That creates a different energy, a different dynamic in the city. So I noticed that in London, you see loads of people now cycling who they're tourists. They don't know the city that well. They're cycling quite slowly. They might be on the wrong side of the road, you know, and it forces, I drive a car as well. So it forces you just to slow down and be more aware. And I think it just creates more equilibrium a little bit. It slows down the general tempo in the city, having more bikes. And that's been one of the benefits of the pandemic, right? That I think across Europe now, over the last year, cities have opened, is it 1,000 kilometers or 1,400 kilometers of bicycle lanes to create more space, less car space, more bicycle space. That's a slow cities move. It's a slow move, and it's a permanent thing. For most of them, it's not going to change. You don't build new bicycle lanes and then the pandemic stops, you rip them out. I think they'll stay, and that's going to feed into this slow effect that you're seeing in urban life in many different ways around the world.
And then in your thinking, what you are moving, where you are going now after thinking about aging and the rules of aging, what ideas you have, what curiosity you have, what
Yeah,
interests you
I'm,
talk about in the next month and years.
yeah, I'm actually, well, like Darwin, Charles Darwin described himself as a slow thinker. I sort of think I'm a Darwin slow thinker.
Well, it's impossible to think fast.
Yeah, it is, but
Yeah.
it's often not that great. The result, is it? I mean, you need to have reaction, but you also need reflection, and definitely slow reflection. And I'm on team slow when it comes to reflection. I don't have any big plans for a new project or book at the moment, but what is interesting me particularly now is the whole kind of digital thing. And it's a bit late in the day. We've had digital for a long time, but the pandemic has just increased the presence of the screen and that whole hybrid model that I think is going to emerge between, you know, working at home, working away, going to conferences, some holograms, people speaking. There's a whole new language, a whole new idiom, a new vernacular, a new visual wallpaper that's being created in the world. And I find that fascinating. And I don't know 100% what I think about it. I'm still thinking slowly. But I feel that maybe the next thing I do might be something in the digital space. Again, I don't know what it would be, but that's what I find myself reading a lot about now and experiencing in my own life. And yeah, so there may be some link between, well, there inevitably will be some link between slow and aging, and it'll all fit in there with digital somehow. So
Cool.
watch this space.
Let me take one more question
Sure.
from questions and answer from our colleague Gadir Purharsem. I'm going to read what he's saying. So I don't know actually the question. It's just because we are about to finish and this is the last question. So let's take this surprise for you and me.
There we go.
What is this question?
Love a good surprise.
I know him, so I guess the question is going to be good. So temporal autonomy is a good terminology for individuals, time control, and assessment of value of time. Temporal autonomy. Coming back to the current pandemic situation, is the slow movement slowness? If the slow movement slowness is good and it should be appreciated, then the question that that why people putting too much pressure on laboratories and governments for fast delivery of vaccines?
Hmm. Yeah.
How do you see this contradiction? Is a contradiction actually, or is not? Because there are moments on time that we have to rush,
Yeah.
others we have to go
And,
slowly.
and,
So in
and
this case,
exactly. Yeah. We want the vaccines to come quickly, but we want them to come well at the same time. We don't want to cut corners and get bad vaccines, because that's going to be even worse than having no vaccine, right? So the way I see the vaccine thing, and the way I see any kind of fast move, I mean, Aristotle said famously that deliberation should be slow, but the action should be fast. And I think that's a good example of the COVID stuff. You do a lot of the slow research has been done for many years, going on in institutes and universities, learning about mRNA and all the different kinds of ways of doing vaccines. That was all kind of slow, scientific, deep, slow scientific research. And then when the time came to act, because we had done the slow homework, many of these companies and institutes were able to deliver a vaccine much more quickly than we expected. So to me, the vaccine rollout is a good example of how fast and slow interact and work together. You do the slow stuff now so that when you've got to go fast later on, you can do it, right? And get it right. I hope they haven't gone too fast, right? So far, so good, right?
let me be more radical on the question of Gadir. You told us that you were not that happy with the pandemics as experience. But maybe, let's say, Ray Kurzweil, the chief engineer of Google today, nowadays, he's happy because actually the rush to get the vaccines and to see that the solution when we have a real problem lies on engineering and science.
Mm.
So it's not the moment to ask a poet, a thinker, a novelist. It's a moment to ask the government to put money on big global
Mm.
corporations full of scientists and engineers. So it seems that at the end, they are the ones that say that
You need
solve
both.
our problems.
Well, this is the problem. This is one of the big problems today, is the tyranny of Silicon Valley, right?
Yes.
Pushing this idea of everything must be frictionless. We want friction, because it's when you get friction, you get light, you get heat, you get sparks, you get new ideas, right? And I think that's a classic example of the arrogance of STEM science. We need the science, of course we do, but we need the poets, we need the novelists, we need the artists to help us tell the stories that will allow us to use the science wisely, right? So if you want to say the pandemic is a mini pilot project for tackling climate change, right?
Yes.
Science is going to deliver the goods on the concrete front, but in order to get there, we need to tell ourselves the right stories. We need to inspire people. We need to move people. We need to bring people together. And scientists in chemistry laboratories won't do that. Poets will. Sculptors will, painters will, playwrights will, right? It's the artists, it's the creatives, it's all the other people in the society. We need them both. And you could think of it as, this is maybe the wrong way to think of it, but well, why not? You could think of the science as the fast in that case, and the storytelling is the slow. We
Yes.
need the two together. They're two sides of the same coin. That is the lesson of the pandemic, right? It was only once we had this extraordinary story that had to be, that we were able to get the vaccines, and we're still trying to tell stories to get people to get vaccinated, right? You could produce vaccines, but millions of people will be too scared to take them. You need all the stuff around the science. The science alone is not enough. Silicon Valley is not going to solve all our problems. It's creating many more problems, I would argue, than it's solving at the moment. So we need the fast, we need the slow. We need to find the tempo giusto, right? That's the way forward.
Thank you,
individually and
Carl.
collectively.
Great ending. This is a very, very, very nice ending. So we appreciate very much the time with you.
Thank you very much. It's
Thank
been
you
a lot of
very
fun.
much. We will listen you again in the next weeks when this is recorded. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.